You are listening to The Conversation Weekly from The Conversation.
So, good morning. Good morning to you all, and welcome to this leaders session of the North Atlantic Council.
The language was fawning, embarrassing at times, from the head of Nato, Mark Rutte, who referred to Donald Trump as daddy at one point.
Let him fight for about 2-3 minutes, then it's easier to stop him.
And then daddy has to sometimes use strong language to
You have to use
stop
strong
him.
language.
When Trump departed the NATO summit in The Hague in late June, European leaders breathed a visible sigh of relief that he had not made any more angry criticisms of the alliance. After months of pressure from the US, NATO members, except Spain, agreed to increase their spending on defence to 5% of GDP by 2035. Trump called it very big news.
This is a big win for Europe and for actually Western civilization.
Trump also confirmed the US's commitment to NATO's core Article 5, which means that an attack on one NATO country is deemed an attack on all of them.
I left here saying that these people really love their countries. It's not a ripoff, and we're here to help them protect their country.
How did we get to the point where Europe is so unable to defend itself that it was forced to resort to outright flattery and prostration before the feet of an American president that many of its leaders are uncomfortable with? I'm Gemma Ware, and in this episode, my colleague Laura Hood, the politics editor at The Conversation in the UK, hears from 3 European defence experts that we met at a recent conference in Italy to understand why the EU dropped the ball on its own defence and what its options are now. This is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. Laura, can you describe where we are?
We're in Italy. We're here for the Vision Conference on the Europe of the Future. And the setting is this idyllic Tuscan monastery that we're walking in now. We're just walking through the cloisters.
It feels to me like the epitome of old Europe, this powerful symbol of something that was once glorious and has kind of faded slightly but is still beautiful.
Yeah, so this place dates from the 14th century, and you can really feel its age in every room that you go into. It's tucked away in the hills above Siena, and it's a symbol of the power of old Europe, that this conference is trying to tackle some of the big questions facing Europe in the 21st century.
We're going to be addressing one of those big questions today, which is the question of defence. Why is defence occupying the minds of the politicians, the researchers, and the people from think tanks who are here in this monastery?
Well, the obvious answer to that is, of course, the conflict that's happening on Europe's eastern border. But what we're seeing is that stress has triggered all kinds of new and interesting conversations about defence specifically that haven't been going on in Europe for a very, very long time. So we're going to be finding out from these experts that are here in Siena why those conversations haven't been happening and what it means now for Europe to be reconsidering its role in global military operations as a group rather than as individual member states.
Great, let's go and talk to some people who've been thinking about this a long time.
Let's go.
Can you just say your name and your job description?
So my name is Anna Juncos. I'm a professor of European politics at the University of Bristol.
We met Anna in an old, slightly echoey dining room at the former monastery. It had large doors that opened out onto a balcony overlooking the Tuscan hills. Anna is an expert in European security and defence. What is happening in this moment that has changed the nature of our discussion about European defence?
There are 2 main problems or main threats that the European Union now is facing, and European states more generally, not just EU members but also non-EU members. The main threat is very clear and comes from Russia. If Russia was to achieve its military objectives in Ukraine, most EU member states believe that Russia wouldn't stop there. Therefore, it's very important for EU member states to do everything that they can to support Ukrainians' war effort, and that requires, a huge amount of resources in terms of defense, and also a commitment to support the implementation of any peace agreement when it's reached. And then, of course, the most important kind of issue that we're facing at the moment is the possibility of the US withdrawing from the provision of security guarantees to other NATO members.
Despite the camaraderie on display at the NATO summit at The Hague, Anna believes that the US will inevitably pull back from its role as the defender of Europe.
In the best case scenario, we might see a partial withdrawal or a kind of de facto withdrawal of the US from NATO, with European states being left to provide conventional defense in case of an armed attack on European soil. In the worst case, we could see a full withdrawal from the US, from NATO. We could also see a US becomes a spoiler within NATO, a US that becomes an antagonistic actor vis-a-vis European states. So, a number of scenarios there, all very worrying and very concerning for European states.
As the US slowly shifts its defence priorities towards the Pacific and away from Europe, European countries are still working through their reactions. Anna likened it to the stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance.
I think we're still not clear whether we have reached yet this acceptance stage of grief. We're still denying and dealing with it, and at different paces in different countries. Most governments in Europe still want the US to be engaged. They still need the US to be engaged. And this is why we're seeing discussions about whether we can pacify Donald Trump by committing to this 5% total expenditure on defense.
The European Commission, the executive branch of EU government, only appointed its first Commissioner for Defence in December 2024. There is no EU army and no consensus as to whether democratic nations could ever allow one to be built. To understand how we got to this point, Anna took us back to the period after the Second World War, when there were big ambitions for European defence.
At the end of the Second World War, there was this idea to establish a European defence community, which would kind of pull competences at the national level in defence to the European level, creating a supranational organization with its own Minister of Defence, its own kind of military committee, and so on. And the idea was that in that way, they could kind of integrate West Germany into kind of a military structure and avoid the dangers of a Third World War. And that idea was discussed at the time. However, in the 1950s, failed because the French Assembly voted down the proposal.
France itself had proposed the European Defence Community in 1950, and it was signed by Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, France and Italy, and West Germany 2 years later. But when it went before the French Parliament for ratification, it was rejected and essentially died.
There were concerns about national sovereignty, and we will see those concerns coming up again and again and again when it comes to discussions about security and defense at the European level. The failure of the European defense community meant that progress in this area became a taboo when it came to discussions within the context of the European communities, and all of these discussions were moved to NATO. And NATO then became the main organization in charge of providing that kind of collective defense. So for most of the Cold War period then, defense is something that NATO does and the EU focuses on economic issues. But then comes the end of the Cold War.
Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev announced he is resigning as head of the Soviet Communist Party and recommended that the party's ruling Central Committee be disbanded, which in effect would mean the end of communist rule in the Soviet Union.
And then there is again a discussion about should we move forward towards political integration, and does this mean that we could also consider issues relating to foreign policy, security and defense? And so by 1992, with the adoption of the Maastricht Treaty, there is an agreement among the member states that they should move forward in that area. And the Maastricht Treaty already foresees the need to integrate in matters of security and defense, and even talks about this establishment of a common defense policy and eventually this idea of a common defense for its member state. But of course, for the next 20, 30 years, we've seen little progress. There's still this concern about national sovereignty. There are also concerns about duplication with NATO. And this, again, remains something that member states don't want to progress. And this is where we are today, in a way.
What's at the heart of this tension between national sovereignty and EU decision-making when it comes specifically to defence?
I mean, defence is something where member states feel that, national sovereignty needs to be protected because it's very sensitive. No one wants to be involved in a war, or no one wants to be involved in a decision that relates to the deployment of armed forces that will mean that their citizens will be put at risk.
There are also big differences between different EU countries when it comes to the threats they face and the things they need to defend themselves from.
Do they come from the east? Do they come from the south? What kind of approach do they have to the use of force? We have countries that are very experienced when it comes to deploying expeditionary force. We have countries that are less experienced.
Some EU countries, such as Ireland, Malta and Austria, remain militarily neutral, and along with Cyprus aren't members of Nato. Others, such as France and Italy, have sizable defence industries that they want to protect. There's also a divide between the way countries see their relationship with the US.
There's a group of member states that really appreciate very strong collaboration, a very strong relationship with the US, because they believe that their security depends on that provision from the US, in particular those that are kind of very near the eastern flank. And then we have other member states such as France that has always kind of advocated for a much more autonomous approach to the provision of security and defense in Europe. And this has also complicated discussions and negotiations at the European Union level.
So how have we ended up in this situation where we are so reliant on the US, where Europe is not able to go alone via NATO, via any other shared decision-making process? Was there a moment where we dropped the ball and we could have taken a different path?
Well, I think there were several missed opportunities, and the most important thing was that member states basically did not maintain a balance when it came to the transatlantic relationship. This imbalance has only grown, and the transatlantic gap has only grown over time. The main problem was with the end of the Cold War, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the disappearance of the external threat. Lots of member states kind of dropped the ball and actually took the decision that they were going to free ride on the US. And, this is the whole discussion about the peace dividend, dedicating resources that had previously been allocated to defense to other priorities. The Eurozone crisis didn't help. Defense budgets were again squeezed. But generally, the assumption among European decision makers was that the US was going to be the eternal ally. And all planning and decisions were made on the basis of that assumption. And of course, the first Trump administration already kind of challenged those assumptions. Again, we saw big increases in defense with the first Trump administration, obviously also resulting from the Crimea annexation in 2014 by Russia. And there was already kind of a realization about the need to kind of strengthen strategic autonomy at the time. But again, the most important thing was to keep the US in, and that anything that would kind of lead to an independent kind of capability or strategic autonomy in security and defense was only pushing the US out. And lots of countries were very reluctant to push the US because they are still very dependent on defense guarantees from the US.
So we are effectively guilty of what the current US administration is accusing us of, relying on them, but also at the same time being fearful of pushing them away by being too independent. So both things are essentially true at the same time.
Yes. And to be fair, I mean, the US also gets things out of this dependence in terms of political clout and also in terms of economic interest, because, of course, that dependence is also evident in terms of procurement being very dependent on US defense contractors. In a way, I guess this is how bullies also act. They benefit from ensuring that the people that they are bullying are always dependent on them. And in particular, in Central and Eastern European countries have always been very reluctant to do anything that might result in criticisms from the US. On the other hand, the US also maintains that very schizophrenic attitude towards security and defense by telling them, you need to become autonomous, you have to spend more. But of course, spend more American weapons. So it's like, be independent, but don't be too independent.
A number of European countries are locked into deals with American defence contractors, for example, for surface-to-air Patriot missiles. But at the same time, defence companies in Italy and France are trying to secure purchases of their own surface-to-air missiles from fellow EU member states. Now the European Union is taking steps to encourage member states to buy defence equipment from suppliers within Europe rather than the US. In May, the EU adopted a new €150 billion lending instrument to boost defence production across the bloc.
We haven't seen how this is going to work in practice, but the initial ideas behind this instrument is that it will have a European preference. So if you are getting cheap loans from the European Commission, which is guaranteed by the EU budget, then at least 65% of that equipment will have to be provided by companies that are based in the EU. Or there's also a provision for countries as Ukraine, so that would also be included in that 65%, EFTA countries, but also countries with a security partnership, which now applies also to the UK, Norway and others. So there is some kind of flexibility. For example, Australia just said that they want to negotiate that kind of security partnership so that they can be part of that 65%. And there is also the provision of 35% could come from outside the EU. So they're always trying to find that balance, but it's a very difficult balance to be found because of those very different interests, not only on the part of the member state, but of course, kind of the pressures that they have from the US.
And yet, regardless of these efforts at joint procurement, Anna says all this will take time. And for now, Europe's security under NATO is heavily reliant on American defence capacity.
You know, it is the US which provides the command and control assets for any kind of operations. It is the US that provides strategic enablers. So we're talking about strategic airlift, air-to-air refueling, intelligence, reconnaissance and surveillance assets. I think the most optimistic kind of assessments of, kind of predict that we might need minimum 5 years to be anywhere close to this. Generally they're expecting this to take at least 10 years for Europeans. And Europeans, when they talk about Europeans, they also generally tend to include also Canada to provide a security to the transatlantic area if the US was focusing on Asia. But yeah, optimistically, I guess 10 years, if we act now and if there is the political will to start replacing these assets and to form a coalition of the willing within NATO, that would be the kind of the earliest that we could see, Europeans really being able to operate and to provide that conventional defense to Europe without the US. And we're not talking about nuclear deterrence, we're just talking about the kind of conventional deterrence.
One country in particular holds more cards than everyone else when it comes to European defence, and that's France. It's the only EU member state with nuclear weapons, and unlike the UK, wouldn't rely on American technology to deploy a nuclear warhead.
This is because of the history. General de Gaulle wanted to make sure that France will be independent, completely independent from the US.
This is François Lafond. He's a former assistant professor at Sciences Po University in Paris, who has recently been working as an expert on the Western Balkans. François has a good understanding of the current debates within France about its nuclear deterrent.
French President Charles de Gaulle goes to Moscow, urging French-Russian unity to reduce East-West tensions. In the same year, he evicts NATO from France.
In 1966, General de Gaulle withdrew France from NATO's integrated command structure, meaning all American and NATO military personnel had to leave French territory.
Because we were not going to be under the US or NATO umbrella, to have our own capacity to protect ourselves. So the nuclear power was the easy way to get this independence and sovereignty.
And there has been some discussion of the potential for France to extend what's called its nuclear deterrence umbrella to effectively cover the rest of Europe, should they need it, as we move into a world where the US is potentially less engaged. What would that look like, and what are France's vital interests that would trigger the use of this nuclear deterrent?
This is a very complicated and long-term discussion. The point is that for sometimes the French president mentioned that we can think about it. So what does it mean? That means that If our European partners, because we are a member of the European Union, we have a treaty where we have an article, the article 42.7, mentioned that if one of the countries of the European Union is attacked by somebody, another potential enemy, the others have the possibility to help him. I mean, quasi the obligation. So the point of this, the proposal of President Macron is to say, well, okay, let's discuss how our French defense system, by the nuclear deterrence, could eventually also apply for our partners. Because if there is a problem in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, this is also our French interest at a certain point, which will be considered. So let's discuss. And for the first time, I have heard that the Chancellor Merz, the new Chancellor in Germany, said that effectively we could have a discussion about what does it mean concretely. A vital interest, what does it mean for you French? We are not at the point that we have defined all the doctrine and what will happen if there is a problem. But at least there is a discussion in parallel of what's going on with NATO and the potential withdrawal of the US or the incapacity of the US to use nuclear deterrence that they put in the NATO system.
It feels as though there's a lot of energy around these conversations that has been prompted by the current global situation. Are you getting the sense that some fresh momentum has been added to European conversations about defence in recent months and years?
Of course, because at the border of the European Union, you've got a country which has been attacked, invaded, that you've got 1 million of people dead on our continent, and because one of the consequences also of that is the number of refugees. Numbers of refugees in Poland, in Germany, in Romania, in other countries. We thought, because we have built this European Union on the idea that no, this is not anymore possible to have a war on the continent. And 60, 70 years after, we have a war. So this is a wake-up call and say, guys, some of the countries, they did not spend any money for their army. Look at the Germans, look at some Italians. So the point is, yes, there is a new attention to this defense concept. We need still army. Maybe we need different way of defend ourselves. That's why the topic of the nuclear deterrence is there. Because with that, of course, you need some conventional capabilities. But at least you have the way of telling to the opponent, guy, if you attack me, I will destroy you.
When we speak about the conflict in these terms, it sounds like what we're really saying is that it's not just Ukraine alone that's in a war with Russia. Europe is in a war with Russia.
No, we are in war against Russia, of course. I mean, this is not on the military dimension. This is on the disinformation. This is on the cyber attacks. So yes, we are at war, hybrid war, because they are against our democracies.
While the focus right now in many European capitals is on Russia, and that's what's driving renewed efforts for a common European defence, others see threats coming from elsewhere too.
We are just talking on media about Russia. That is a very big misunderstanding. It's not just about Russia.
This is Francesco Grillo. He's an academic fellow at Bocconi University in Milan, a visiting fellow at the European University Institute, and also the founder of the Vision think tank that organised the Siena conference.
Russia is a very big threat, but we need also to be more capable to be present in, for instance, Libya or Syria, or given the right condition, Gaza, Iran, you name it, our neighborhood. We haven't been able to be present in our neighborhood for decades, much before Russia invaded Ukraine. So we need to prepare ourselves for different scenarios in terms of what is the problem that we want to defend from.
Francesco believes it's meaningless to focus too much attention on what percentage of GDP NATO members should be spending on defence.
5% or 2% or 3.5%. The amount of money that we need to spend on defense very much depends what kind of conflict we want to prepare ourselves. We need to acknowledge that we live in 2025 and not any longer the time of the Korea War. War now are fought with drones, electronic warfare. On that very front, we need Ukraine more than Ukraine needs us, because they were forced to become absolutely industrial leader on that thing. And we will need much more, very likely, less F-35, no? Like the famous, very expensive American jets. So when we want to calculate how much money does this thing cost, very much depends on the technological factor, which changed completely the equation.
One of the enduring problems with European defence has been whether the EU bloc should have a European army, and if so, how it should be managed.
There is no common army, no common defense capability without citizenship, European citizenship. So we really need some positive action to encourage the development of some sense of belonging to this strange animal called the EU, alongside our being still citizen of Italy, France, or even UK, somehow. For instance, some even compulsory civil service. Defending ourselves is not just about tank, it's also about population to be prepared if something nasty happens.
Data presented in Siena by the French polling company Cluster 17 showed that in a recent cross-European poll, 61% of people were in favour of a common European army, with even 49% of 18 to 24-year-olds expressing support for it. Francesco believes there will eventually be a European army.
If we are still having a European Union, in 10 years' time, we will certainly have a European army. It may be a European Union whose shape, the Europe of the future, will be very different from the one that we have now. Possibility even slimmer, more consistent, more efficient, and more capable to engage citizens. This is very important, more democratic.
So, Laura, we're back from Siena now. We heard there at the end from Francesco talking about this knotty question of a European army and what needs to happen before it can be created. It really takes us to the heart of this conundrum about Europe and its defence, doesn't it?
Yeah, this is a question I'm kind of obsessed with because it's such an interesting conundrum for democratic nations. The European Union is a cluster of democracies, and in a democracy, it's the state that has the right to wield violence and the responsibility to maintain an army to protect its own citizens. So when you are talking about a collection of democratic nations, who is in charge of the fundamental questions of what an army is for, who populates it, and what it fights for, and who it fights for?
There are also these questions at the moment, and we heard a lot of people talking about this in Siena, around recruitment, and there are challenges in finding people to be in armies. So how that would translate at the European level is another big question too.
I think that's why you and I both found the results of that poll so interesting, that there was even support amongst 18 to 24-year-olds, the people who would presumably be most likely to be fighting in such an army. Obviously, no one's talking about conscription or forced military work from people in different member states. But these are the kinds of questions that you need to thrash out at the theoretical stage if you want to pursue a shared project of that kind.
Thinking more broadly about NATO, it's been a week since the summit at The Hague. The dust is beginning to settle. But what questions are we still left with now?
The immediate question was, how come Spain got out of having to commit 5% GDP to defence spending when everyone else had to? That's going to be one to watch for the immediate future. But the other thing that I think is going to be interesting to look out for is what the NATO member states actually spend their 5% on, because it seems like in the detail of the agreement that they can actually count things like
pensions for military veterans and various kinds of domestic infrastructure spending as part of that 5% GDP on defence. So we should be looking out for them stretching the definition of what defence spending is, I think.
Definitely one to watch. And I know you'll be getting academics to start thinking about these questions in the coming weeks. So thanks so much, Laura, for working with us on this episode and coming back on the pod.
Thanks, Gemma.
That's it for this week's episode. It was written and produced by me, Gemma Ware, and Laura Hood, with production assistance from Mend Marawani and Katie Flood, and sound design and mixing by Eloise Stevens. Our theme music is by Nita Saul. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can also sign up for our free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience to help you make better decisions. If you like what we do, please consider supporting us at donate.theconversation.com. That's donate.theconversation.com. And please do also rate and review the show wherever you follow us. It really helps us reach more people. Thanks very much for listening.